And I would like to ask you if you have any questions that you may have for Glenn, because I think he is the pioneer here in South Florida doing this peanut thing, and he has tried all different things. So I think it would be a good opportunity to ask Glenn about his thoughts about anything that you may like to know about.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I know some of you came a long ways to get here, and I appreciate that. I wanted to give you a brief, just sort of a brief history of me and Perennial Peanut. I started with some floor graze over at my house, and then not long after that, that's probably been about 10 or 12 years ago, then put in some eco-turf, a pasture of eco-turf, I say a pasture, a hay field, which we're cutting for haylage to feed I raised some Black Angus cows, and also planted some eco-turf in my yard, as Dr. Sollenberger was saying at his house. To tell you how persistent eco-turf is, it has crept through a hedge of, golly, I don't know what it is, Indian hawthorn and a couple other plants. And one day I was looking, and it had crawled up behind like 4 rows of hardy board on the side of my house and was sticking out, in between the hardy board. So the stuff is, and of course, Dr. Sellers says I don't mind killing it. We've not killed it yet. I mean, it is very, very persistent. A couple other things I wanted to mention to you. When IFAS planted the strips in here, we also had some additional material, and we no-tilled it into this pasture. And so what you see outside of the fenced area was no-tilled in, both here, and then I did ride up and look. There's some stuff up about 100 yards north of here where the dirt is a little bit heavier and it's established a little bit better. But in these areas where we no-tilled it, cows were put on this almost immediately and have been on it ever since, as far as in a grazing situation. And we did that just to see, is this stuff going to establish in that kind of situation? And it has. The other thing I wanted to mention, that's the eco-turf and peace, and you'll see them both here and in the plots. If you're interested in seeing the 2 new varieties, the peace, I got that wrong. Here you see the eco-turf and the floor graze. If you wanted to see the peace and Tito, I have some plots right around the corner that are straight. They're not incorporated in grass. 2 of them were some plots that we planted just to use as seed plots, and then planted some acreage across the street. And then we moved some of that to North Florida, and have got some couple of hay fields up there. And so the other experience that I've had, I have stripped Jigs Bermuda into some floor graze, straight peanut to get a mix for grazing. We've also gone the other way and no-tilled eco-turf and floor graze into both Bahia grass and Jigs Bermuda. And those we're using mostly for grazing purposes. So I want to give you a little bit of history on my experience with peanut, and I did want to open it up to questions and answers, and I love that we've got all these people here. The reason I'm last in the program, I want to tell you guys, the smart people went first, okay? And so with that being said, any kind of questions anybody has, I'd love to try to field, and I may ask for help because I've got the experts here. So, yes, sir.
On the no-till, did you herbicide before you tilled it?
The question was, on the no-till, did we herbicide before? And the answer is no. We came into this Bahia pasture, just ran through it with a no-till. Those sprigs that were incorporated into the ground got covered up, and they grew. The sprigs that were sticking up a little bit, let me tell you that while the cattle love eating the tops of the peanut, they love eating those rhizomes too. And that was, I think, in July that we did that. If that rhizome was sticking out of the ground, I can assure you that a cow came along and she pulled that rhizome out of the ground and ate it. So, but as far as herbiciding in this, I think the only thing that I have done, we had some smut grass issues, and I did try coming across and wiping the smut grass. And then other than that, we probably would have had an application of 2,4-D. There was never any imposed, because the imposed would have taken out the hay grass. So we didn't do that. Great question.
Glenn, can you tell us about the fertilization that you did here? How much you fertilized after you planted this since 2014?
I don't know. I do know I did a lime application here. Dr. Joe, I don't think this pasture has been fertilized since we planted it. I have come along at other times, not on this piece. I don't think this has been fertilized at all. What you're looking at here And I would also encourage you, before you leave, and I rode out there to make sure it wasn't too wet. We had about 2.5 inches of rain yesterday. And just up here, 100 yards north of us, while we no-tilled this in, we did that as well. This is a pretty high sandy hill, even though you might find it hard to believe right now after all that rain. It's a little heavier dirt out here, and it did establish a little bit better. And you won't get stuck out there. If you do, I've got a strap in the back of the truck and we can pull you out. But it's a little bit squishy, but feel free to just ride out there and look at any of that if you'd like to. So.
I believe, one more question, I believe they talked about it moving 3 feet, earlier he talked about it moving.
Yes, sir.
Maybe 3 feet a year, is that right?
I want to ask
Yeah, Dr. Sullenberg.
Dr. Sullenberg. Yes. What have you seen, Dr. Sullenberg, as far as creeping? Just to answer your question, this was planted. We planted on either 30-inch centers or on 15-inch centers, and it doesn't take very long that it fills in.
It's not going to, that's not going to happen in year 1 and year 2.
Okay.
But once it has so what's spreading is a good question, right? What is going to spread? What's going to spread are those rhizomes underground. So you're not going to see runners across the soil surface. You're just going to say, I planted it there and there's a yellow flower over there. That's what you're going to see. So that rhizome mat needs to establish. So after those first 2 years, then you're going to start to see that spread. And I think 2 to 3 feet a year is probably reasonable.
What you will see, there were 7-foot strips of hay grass left out here in the test plot fields inside the fence. And when you look in amongst that, what was a 7-foot wide Bahia grass strip, you will find some sections, especially where there's the ecoturf, that the ecoturf has completely permeated that 7-foot strip. So. Yes, sir.
Lynn, on your tilled in peanut and your jigs and your Bahia grass, what's your fertilizer regimen? Are you fertilizing it as peanut or are you fertilizing it as Bahia grass or jigs?
That's a great question. In some areas, like over here, this is I'm running a lot less intensive program over here. And so some of this has not received any fertilization, whether it be for the grass or for the peanut. We did do a lime application to just make sure pH-wise we're in good shape. Over at the house, where I've got I'm running in some sections there, I've got 40 head of pregnant cows that are on 10 acres of pasture. And I basically will rotate them from one 10-acre block to another. In that pasture, I basically fertilized it for grass production. In fact, we came through there, and I've done it both ways over the years, but in that case, we came in with 80 pounds of N, typically 80 pounds of K. I do always try to take care of the peanut as well. And I know some of the studies have said, you can get away with no nitrogen application. I do believe that the peanut is contributing a lot to the grass without the additional nitrogen. But in this case, where we're trying to run a lot of cows, I try to really push the grass as well. So, and the peanut responds.
Brings up another question. They have always told us with like legumes, like clover and all, you don't put nitrogen because it retards the development. Is that the same situation in peanut or not? Do you know?
That's another great question, and I would lean to one of these smart people at that point. Is that going to lessen the nitrogen fixation?
We did a couple studies with nitrogen. One, during the establishment period, we applied either none or 40 pounds of nitrogen. And what we found is that peanut establishment is faster with the nitrogen if did you hear if weeds are controlled, all right? If you've got a lot of grassy weeds and stuff out there, then the nitrogen simply advantages them versus the peanut. In an established stand, we had a conversation during the break, and it relates to a comment about managing for jigs or peanut. If your question that I was asked was, can I establish peanut in Bermuda grass? And I said, yes, I think you can. And so Glenn will, I guess, based on experience, say that that's true. But you will not get the same yield from a Bermuda grass peanut mixture as you will from a Bermuda grass hay field where you are fertilizing at a recommended nitrogen rate for hay. That's just simply not going to happen, okay? So don't expect to get the same yield out of a Jigs peanut mixture as you're going to get with Jigs with 80 pounds of nitrogen after each harvest. That's pie in the sky. That's just simply biologically not going to happen. So you either, if you want to associate Bermuda and peanut, you have to accept that the cost of not applying that nitrogen is going to be a lower stocking rate, less forage production. That's just what you're looking at, I think.
Thanks, Dr. Lynn. One thing that's worth mentioning, I took some Angus calves that were on a straight Bahia pasture with molasses and weighed them over about a 60-day period, and they were gaining 0.64 pounds a day. I took them and put them on some straight perennial peanut with no molasses and weighed them over the course of the next year. They went from gaining 0.64 pounds a day to 1.7 something pounds a day. And the reason I did that was not any of these smart people here, but many people were telling me you couldn't graze on a straight perennial peanut. Their thoughts were, like most legumes, you'd have bloat issues and other things, and there was none. They did very well, and that's what I like about having that mix. Those cattle really do well on that. So, any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions. Do you have some type of a list of producers where we can get these different varieties?
Yes. Are you looking for like varieties to plant? Is that what you mean? There is the Perennial Peanut Producers Association. If you do a Google search on that, there is a list of all the producers out there and what if they offer rhizomes for sale, what variety of rhizomes they have for sale. And there are even some people out there who list as they will come out and plant for you if that's what you're looking for. So.
You mentioned the virus stunt virus several times. I tried some eco-turf that I just got at a garden center several years ago, and I thought it was a fungus. I got yellow spots. Maybe it was stunt virus. Could you just talk about diseases a little bit?
Well, I would ask one of these smart people to talk about diseases, but what I would tell you, if you bought something at one of these big box stores that said eco-turf, I would ask some of these other people, I don't know that you really got eco-turf, because a lot of times that the Reaping's Golden Glory was being marketed for a long time as perennial peanut, and that's one that grows above the ground, and that's one that I would think would get the large yellow spots. I'd just make sure you were dealing with eco-turf. Is there anybody else who'd like to address that?
They were selling that up north too. It was the seeded peanut.
Yes. So,
You mentioned
Yes,
that you cut haylage. Was that the eco-turf that you cut the haylage off of?
that is eco. We've cut it off both eco-turf and floor graze. We've also cut it off the piece in the Tito, mostly because it got wet and wasn't going to make square bales, and so it ended up going
So
to cow hay.
that was actually my question. So you have cut and made square bales off of some different varieties?
Actually made square bales off all those varieties as well.
Could you talk about that, your experience there and quality and
You talking about yields, talking about quality of the...
quality above?
Okay. And I think some of that depends, like if you were cutting, like even a jigs grass, at what stage of development you cut it. If you're cutting that hay, cutting it for hay, any one of those varieties at, say, a 5-week period or 6-week period, it's not going to yield as much, but you're going to have a lot more leaf content, and you're going to end up with a better quality hay. As far as yields go, the two new varieties, the Peace and the Tito, are much better yielding. I would say the quality of the hay is, I think cut under the right circumstances, the quality of each one of those hays is probably somewhat similar, depend on when it's cut in its growth period. The one thing I would say, if you're looking at varieties, and I started with floor graze, and I liken that. I was thinking about this. That's sort of the gateway drug, and that's what it was for me. It was the introduction to perennial peanut, If I had it to do over again, I would have planted ecoturf in those situations, whether it be cutting it for hay or grazing it, far above floor graze. If you're just looking at hay production, I'd probably leave floor graze out with the risk of offending anybody. I would leave it out of the mix. I would either, if you're incorporating in a pasture, for me, just to tell you how much I believe in ecoturf, I had rhizomes of both the two new varieties of Peace and Tito that were available to me, and I went out and bought ecoturf rhizomes to cut into a pasture that I have up in North Florida. That's how much I believe in it. If you're just looking at hay production, the Peace and the Tito are more expensive to get into at the beginning, but you're going to have higher yields.
And were you utilizing that hay yourself, or were you selling it?
I've done both. If we're putting up our production, I should tell you, our production down here is mostly for the cattle that we're raising down here. The North Florida stuff, we're trying to put that up, number one, square bales, and sell that to mostly to horse people. It's too valuable a product to be feeding my Angus cows. And I say that wouldn't be the highest and best use. In fact, and I think I've said, if you guys want to see the Peace and Tito varieties, there's two fields. We just, as we go out the entrance here, we make a left and you go, it's not even half a mile. The first road you come to is Florida Avenue. If you were to make a left on Florida Avenue about 200 yards up on the right side of the road, or you'll see it. It's out in the middle of a hay patch. There's grove up above it. You're sort of going up a hill. There's grove up above it, but down below is bahia grass. In the middle of it, you'll see some beautiful lush stuff about this tall. And the only other thing I want to add, what you're looking at here in this field, cows were on this up till about 3 weeks ago. And we pulled the cows off. We've mowed a little bit of it just to see what happens, and then we left some of it unmowed. So what you're looking at is just cows being pulled off for about 3 weeks. If we turned them in here, the first thing they'd go to is that perennial peanut. They love it. So
What variety is that up there?
up there is Peace and Tito. That's the two new, basically hay varieties. And then here you've got ecoturf and floor graze.
I would like just to mention something about the hay quality. Running the lab at ONA, there are two species that I got the most phone calls. That people were, and they just call me when they are disappointed, right? If they get a good result, they don't call me. But then you get a result that you think it's really bad, so they call me. And I'm just running the sample. I'm not the owner of the forage or anything. So the first one is Timothy and alfalfa for horses. That is the world champion. So because people buy that as a cool season forage and they expect the same nutritive value as alfalfa and come back really bad many times. Has a lot of fescue in it, comes from up north, nobody knows what it is. So that's the first one. Second one is peanut. It's primarily because making hay out of peanut is much more, I think it requires much more knowledge than making grass hay. It's a different beast. And when you do not have your equipment, you need to hire somebody to come, right? And that perennial peanut, it needs to be baled right at the right time. And because of the moisture and because of other factors. So the guy don't come to mow it, so then it takes 2 weeks, it gets too old, and then it live on the ground for a long time, you lose all the leaves, and then people bale stems, and the nutritive value, I wouldn't say that it's bad, but it's quite similar to Bermuda or any grass hay. But people say, well, I bought this peanut for my horse because they told me it's like alfalfa. And it is, if you manage right, if you bale right. It can be as good as alfalfa. However, most of the times when you get the samples that just come, they face weather issues like we all do in the hay business, right? So you need to bale a little earlier, a little late, and you lose the leaves. And I have a student that actually did a work for us just to account for that. So because the main factor is losing leaves. That's what we see. It's good if it has a lot of leaves, but sometimes you bale, you don't have any leaves. So she just mix the amounts of leaves and stem, and you can see you start decreasing leaf. It's just a decrease in protein and digestibility. If you see the average for hay in rhizoma peanut that we have at the lab, the protein is 12%. That's the average. So, and that is much below the expected. People expect to have 17, 18. And why is 12? Because we have 5s, right? That's the average, right? We have 18s, but we have 5. So managing that rhizoma peanut hay it's just a different thing, and sometimes people get a little disappointed, not because the EcoTurf or the floor graze is not good, it's just hay management, and it's quite challenging. Larry probably has done hay and worked a lot with rhizoma peanut. He'll be the one to ask questions and has a lot of experience with that.
Thank you, Joe. Along the lines of what Dr. Joe is saying there, I've custom baled all my hay down here when we've done that, and we've used some of the best grass hay producing guys, but they come in and they've never baled perennial peanut. And the first thing that happens is they want to treat it like grass, and they want to go blowing through there, raking it at 15 miles an hour, and they can about knock every leaf off of it. And not by design, they're just used to doing grass. And it is a different animal when it comes to making hay and putting that hay up. So, great question.